Hello and welcome back to PolyToots. Today we are going to be making something from Borderlands 2. I've been playing it recently and pretty cool game, but the art in it is just amazing. But one thing that I kind of saw and wanted to just make was one of these loot chests that you see here. And there's two versions of this and I couldn't quite work out which one I wanted to do, so I haven't really picked any one of them specifically. It's going to be a sort of like a mild amalgamation of both. But yeah, this is what we're going to make. We're going to try and do, the sculpt, retopo, texture, rigging, shaders, animation, and eventually, all in Unity and working. So yeah, let's just get right to it. Okay, so starting off, voxel sculpting, and it's going to be a blank scene. And what I'm going to do is drop down a primitive just to kind of get like a rough scale. And also a center point in the world, which will be quite handy for when we introduce the reference images, because we're going to do one from the front and one from the top. And so we do that by going up to the corner over here, and we're going to choose a reference images for the Z-axis first. And then once we kind of put those in, we'll add another one for the Y. So yeah, don't close down the guides yet, but yeah, so after we do this, make sure you have the transform all turned on, because we want to basically scale these reference images. But if you don't have that transform all, then you'll only scale one view, which you obviously don't want to do, because these have to kind of be the same size for the top and the bottom. So yeah, just scale them and then move them, and when you finish with that, hit that close guides button, just because then you won't accidentally kind of move things around. Once that's done, I'll just clear out that temporary mesh I was using as a reference point and bring in another primitive here that best matches my end shape. So for this, that happens to be a capsule, and I'm just eyeballing it in the center at the moment. But once I add it in, I will actually make sure it's centered properly. And you may be thinking that I've added my shape here in a really weird position, but it will make sense in a bit, I promise. To make sure this is all centered after you add the shape in, first off, I just hit that to center mask button. I think the pivot already was in the center, but it's best to be safe than sorry. And now you see the positions here. These are the X, Y, and Z. I don't want to zero it out on the Y because that's the up and down, so instead I just need to zero out the X and the Z. Next up, if you check your top view, you'll notice our guide shape isn't quite the same as a regular capsule profile, so we're going to need to do some scaling on the Z here to get it close enough. Just make sure you set the layer back to global. You must always do this whenever you scale something non-uniformly, meaning it's okay to scale something on all three axes at the same time. But if you scale on just one of them, you'll need to essentially reset its transforms. This is a pretty common thing in 3D in general, not just 3D Coat. Looking at the top view, I'm sure you can guess why we started with a capsule shape, but like I said before, we really only need its profile or the silhouette from the top. So I used the cutoff tool to do this and change the brush mode to that rectangle marquee thing by hitting the E key on the keyboard. Next up, I'm going to spend way too long trying to find the pose tool, because either all of these icons are grayscale or I have a very specific type of dog vision. We need to change the mode of the pose tool to the paint select option, and then again using the rectangular marquee, we'll just grab a top slice here and move it up while scaling. I do also prefer to hit the reset axis button here just to make sure that it is straight, but it's probably okay. Oh yeah, and I do edit my curves here to be more of a straight line, because the default is sort of this smooth transition. So you just hit Control D on the keyboard to clear the selection, and here I give a little res plus to the model as I'd like a little bit more geometry to work with, but not that much, so I do also do a resample here and just specify the amount I want. Nice. So now we just need to use the pose tool again and do the same as we did before, but this time on the underside. And if you find that the axis is moving too fast compared to the geometry scaling, you can hold the shift key and move only the axis marker. This applies to all tools with an axis gizmo, not just the pose tool. Just going to give my layer a little rename here. It's completely optional, but I'm not a smart man and I get easily confused. Then we're going to duplicate our layer, move it up and cut off the bottom. Then we'll spin it around so it's upside down, and if you hold the control key while rotating, it will snap to 45-degree increments. Just make sure you hold the control key before you start rotating, otherwise your starting rotation will be offset, which is pretty annoying, but that's just how it is. Now, going into an orthographic view, I'm going to move and scale this object so I can use it to essentially cut out our original mesh, using the guides to make sure it's lined up well enough to, again, make sure you set the layer back to global scale when doing a non-uniform scale. When it's in place and you've already clapped your hands due to being happy and knowing it, You can hold the control key while moving this new layer over the top of the original one, and this will perform the Boolean operation. Or you can right click the layer and find the option to do it that way, but I recommend adopting hotkeys, wherever possible. I went back and took a closer look at the reference for this, and I've come to the conclusion that my guides were wrong. I actually don't think the bottom part of the shape scales inwards, so I'm just going back now and cutting it off, which is cool because I get to show you this other tool, which is the base relief thing. And even though it looks weird and the UI is weird and the result is weird, it's a neat little tool for just extruding out a straight massive shape in any one direction. Moving on from that, I want to work a little bit on getting some details in. So I'm going to use the Vox layer tool here and just drag out a rectangle shape for the front piece. And before you hit apply, make sure that the direction is set to vertex normal, which in most cases is a pretty safe choice, but the reason that we need it is our shape needs to extrude out in a few directions and we need them all to be the same. And you probably won't get the right extrude amount on the first go, so don't worry at all about having to undo and try again. Now I'll just do the same for the back, but a slightly different shape. I'm not actually sure I know what the back of this looks like, so I'm just guessing that it's not the same as the front because that would be kind of weird. Oh, and I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, but you can hold the control key down when making a selection to remove it from the selection that you've already made. I'm using a slightly smaller extrude value for the back here, and I did accidentally extrude out some random piece of geometry, which is fine. It happens quite a lot, so you can just grab the cutoff tool just to get rid of it. And since I'm already in the cutoff tool, I hit the H key here while hovering over the front piece to select the right layer, and then I trim off the excess at the bottom and also knock out the middle piece in the middle that I don't need. Then coming back to the back piece, just cutting off a piece or two here just to make it look a bit more, not boring. Quick renaming of the layers to ward off any potential confusion, and I make a new layer called lock, which for now I'll just chuck a box primitive in to block it out, and then I'll worry about that later. I also create a sub layer within the lock layer by hitting that little plus icon, as this is where some cylinders need to live. Depending on the scale of your objects, you may want to give a little res plus to the layer before sticking the cylinders in, or you just add them in and then undo if it doesn't work. To keep things rolling with adding in the primitives, I make a new layer for the hinge at the back, and I also just use the basic cylinder for this. The only thing that caught me by surprise here was I realized that I wasn't entirely sure where to put it. If I put it where I think a hinge should go, that would mean that my guides are super wrong, and since I know how stupid I am, I just assumed that my guides are wrong, so I just put it here instead. There's some pieces on the front here that have this strange cover-like thing on them. They look like they protect the cylinders, but they're also part of the lock itself. And if you look at them in game, they actually flap up when the lid is opened. So for this, we just need a box, and then we just use the cutoff tool and just chop off the bits we don't need. Back to the hinge again, and over to the cylinder primitive. I add a shorter but wider shape onto this. There's no need to make a new layer for it. We can always split it later if we need to. I will make a new layer for the other pieces that will connect the hinge to the lid though, and for that we will go back to the starting shape, which was the capsule, and we're going to use the exact same method as we did in the beginning. We're going to put it in place, slice off the top and the bottom, so we're only keeping the middle, like that profile shape, and then just stretch it out. And again, don't forget to set the scale back to global if you're stretching it in one axis only, and obviously, give it some more resolution if you need to. I think I had to, it was coming in pretty small. At this point, I think we're probably done with our guides. I'm pretty sure they're wrong anyway, so, it doesn't matter. To hide them, you just go back to the menu where we created them, but you select the Edit Image Placement option, and then don't do what I did, which is to decrease their opacity to 0, because you can actually just hit that Hide All button, which, seems much more efficient. If you are wondering if it's possible to just remove the image instead of hiding it, you can't, and I don't know why, but, it is what it is. The current shader that I'm using just isn't working out for me, really. It's too difficult to see the pieces we've extruded out, and we're going to be doing a lot more of that in a bit, so I decided to change the shader by first selecting the base object, and then I just click on a different material here. It has revealed some pretty wonky looking geometry in this area because this material shows like the cavity and the bulges. So to tidy this up a bit, I just enable the symmetry on the X and the Z, and then I just smooth it all out with the Shift key. If you don't quite like how a shader looks, you can always change it by right-clicking on the shader itself. I'm choosing to change the permanent shader settings here because I want to apply this to all of my objects eventually, so like only changing the object's shader settings is no good for this situation. But yeah, I mean, once you're happy with it, just right-click it again and then select the option to apply it to all visible. Hopping back to the hinge area again, I am just using the sphere tool here with the control key held down just to cut out a spherical shape, and then using the same tool just to drop a sphere in the hole that I just made. Then I'll use the cutoff tool, but I make sure that I enable a depth limit, and then I just use that to cut out the shape for the screw. I've hidden the hinge layers for now because I'm going to chop off the lid of this whole thing using the Vox hide tool, and I don't know if you've seen my Screaming Radio tutorial, but the Vox hide tool is pretty cool for stuff like this. You just hide what you want and then bring it back with the objectify hidden option, and it basically splits your mesh but leaves you with a nice gap where it was cut. If you didn't want a gap, then you'd probably just use the standard split tool instead. You may want to make your own hotkeys for objectifying and removing the hidden geometry. Like oftentimes you'll almost certainly want to clear the cache once you've objectified something, because otherwise it will keep coming back when you perform the same function elsewhere, which, I mean, it seems like a pretty stupid default behavior to me, but you know, it is what it is. So next up, I'm going to work on the feet of this chest. There's probably a ton of ways to make this shape the same way, but you know, when in doubt, just stick a box in and start chopping it up. I also use the pose tool here just to bevel out the front a bit. Now you just kind of stick it where you want it and enable symmetry on the X and the Z. Then hit the symmetry button down in the Vox tree window. If you find that your geometry disappears completely, it's because 3D Coat is using some other symmetry point as its like reference. So to make sure it uses our object and not like a blank empty piece of space, just grab any sculpt tool and give the object just like a little tap. And if that doesn't work for you, it's probably because you're in like a marquee mode instead of a brush mode. So just hit the E key and switch to a regular brush instead, and then just try it again. So I'm switching back over to the Vox layer tool here, as I want to extrude a couple of pieces out. I won't go into any major details on this as we literally covered this a few minutes ago, but one thing I will just say is I am making use of symmetry up to a certain point, but then I make sure to turn it off when I do the back side of this thing. And I'm also getting some like insanely high triangle counts with these new shapes, so I do make sure to resample them down a bit after they've been created. Back to the Vox hide tool again for these front covers. It took some fiddling to try and find like the right depth limit, but then I remembered that the entire reason I chose the Vox hide tool in the first place is its ability to bring back geometry if you hold down the control key. This isn't the same as like when you objectify it. It's more like an undo, but like a really awesome undo. But yeah, once I was happy with the shape, I hit my hotkey to objectify what was hidden, and bada bing, bada boom. Now at this point, I'm just like reorganizing my layers a bit because I want to put like a bunch of stuff into the lid layer so that I can eventually kind of like just perform like a transform. And if you hold down the shift key, I think I mentioned this before, but you can actually just move the gizmo itself, and then you can sort of rotate it. And I already kind of know that I've made like a massive mistake here, because yeah, that's not how reality works. So I kind of have to spend a bit of time here just kind of moving things around, scaling, and just making sure that the hinge is sort of roughly kind of where it sort of needs to be. And now from here, I'm going to go back to the lid, and I'm going to hit the V thing there to turn it into a surface mode object. And I'm going to use the live tool called build something. I don't know. I can't remember. It was just on the screen. And the reason I'm using the live clay is that I can specify the amount of extra detail to add. Like here you can see like 1 times 4, I think that is. You know, the difference is sort of night and day. So yeah, I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to add on these little bolty type things. So now I'm going to teach something which I don't think I've actually taught before, but we're going to bring in a mesh from the Retopo room. So I'm first in here just using the points and faces tool, just to kind of put down some like really low poly geometry. And then I'm going to use just some of the Retopo tools themselves. Like I'm holding down Control here to kind of insert like this other edge loop. And then I'm just removing the faces on the outside edge because I'm essentially just creating like a little kind of inset shape here. And then in the Sculpt room, we can go up to the geometry menu, I think it is, or the Sculpt, something like that. And we can actually just import this back in to our Sculpt. It will come in with the same triangle count as the Retopo. So make sure that you do kind of do res plus and also a relax or something maybe. And then, you know, once the shape is in and it has enough kind of detail, you can position it to where you want it. And we're going to use that same thing of just holding down Control while moving that layer over the other one, and it will just basically cut out from our original layer, which is, you know, pretty cool. Now I'm just going to make a new layer for the handle, and the way that I'm going to handle this the way that I'm going to handle this is with the curves tool. So I'm just going to kind of create half of the shape here, and then I'll kind of just use the symmetry just to get the other half. But I'm not starting with the symmetry, which is probably, you know, a little mistake on my half. But what you can do is after you've created it, and I do recommend a few res pluses before you add it into the layer. But yeah, once you have your half piece in, I kind of just use the transform tool here, just to kind of like center it to the object that I've just made, and then I just kind of like put it in roughly the position that I want it, and then using the symmetry tool again. If you reset the symmetry, it will take it back to the root of the world, and now you can use the symmetrical copy button again, and it will basically just, you know, make a copy of it from one side to the other. And again, if it does that weird thing where it's copying the side that you don't want, just, you know, find like a little tool or something and just give the correct side like just a tap or something, and then that should be good. And then yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. You just have to put it in place. There's nothing really special about this. Just going to open up the chest because I want to cut out from the inside, and the easiest way to do that is just to grab that initial shape we made, like the base, and I'm just going to move it up and scale it. And again, make sure you reset the scale back to global if you scale it on one axis. I've probably said that way too many times in this video, but you know, it is important. Yeah, and then again, holding Control whilst moving the layer over the other just to cut it out. And I did cut it out a bit too deep here. It doesn't need to be that deep. We never really see inside it, so I do just give this a little undo and then try again. Moving back to the lock area, I do just want to kind of like round out the corners, so I'm going to use the cutoff tool here with that like rounded marquee thing, that one. And I do enable symmetry for this, but I make sure I set the symmetry to the bounding box of that object because it's kind of floating up. Oh, and also when you're drawing those marquee guides, you can you can press escape before committing, and then you don't have to complete the cut. And this basically allows you to kind of keep tweaking the shape before you actually commit to it. And I'm just speeding through these bits here, just because I'm just essentially just adding in a bunch of primitives. Like these now will be the cogs. We don't actually need to do like proper 3D cogs here because we can kind of take care of it in the texture, and it's such a kind of small model anyway that, you know, there's no point in kind of wasting a bunch of triangles on like a proper cog here. I do just use the symmetry here just to make a symmetrical copy. That will make the retopo a bit easier too. And then I just kind of smooth out the edges with the shift key. And then just a quick cut off here because I think it was extruding out a bit too much. And then again, I'm just going to smooth out this shape as well, just a touch. And now for the actual like lock piece itself, the one with the key. Again, it's just a cylinder, but I'm going to use the pose tool here and I'll just grab a bit with the paint select and then just scale it down, move it into place, and then just apply our material. And then I think I grab the build brush here, and I basically just give like a rough sculpt for like the key area. We don't have to do this here, we could easily add this in the paint room afterwards, but you know, might as well. So now I'm just isolating the hinge at the back, and I'm going to use the box extrude tool here with the rectangular marquee selection, just to basically draw out some areas to do like an inward extrude, because we just want to sort of like indent this. And I know that my result kind of hasn't come out quite, well, I mean, it is symmetrical, but it looks a little wonky. That's fine for me, but I can totally understand if that's not okay for you. And I know that the representation of all that stuff is a bit weird, like you draw the line, but the black marker area seems a bit weird. Just looks like a bit of a glitch to me, so hopefully that can get fixed soon, but it doesn't actually affect what gets indented or not. And then we're just going to do the exact same thing for the little lock pipes here. So yeah, I mean, it is just the exact same thing, but I probably do just reduce the extrude amount down by just a touch. So now I've just made a new layer. I'm going to call this one chain, and there's basically, on the actual model, there's like a little sort of chain that hangs underneath the lock. And so for this, I'm going to use like an actual chain primitive type thing here, but it's a curve, and this basically puts you into the curves tool, and so it keeps our previous selection there. So just hit escape to cancel that out. And then yeah, I just kind of like try to put the chain in place here, but I notice that it's just like, it's too big, you know, like the links in this chain are just too large, and I don't know of a way to actually like scale them down so that there's more links here. So all I did was basically make the actual curve larger, and then apply that in, and then just basically scale the whole mesh down afterwards, and again just kind of giving it our material. Okay, and then lastly, well, sort of lastly, we'll end as we started. I mean, we'll end as we sort of started, because technically we started with a box, but we then made a capsule. So that's what we're gonna make again here. And this is basically going to be used again for the same thing. Like, we're going to just use the profile of this shape for the flippy outy bits. I'm not really sure what they're called, and I'm using symmetry here just to, because I mean, I can just basically merge these objects into one, so it's a lot easier than having to kind of get two. And it did come in at like a crazy high res, so I did just resample that down. And then I do use the cutoff tool here, and I use the symmetry from the object's bounds. And I do make sure to turn off the depth limit on that tool, so I can just make my cut, and then it'll cut it from both sides, which is pretty cool. Next up, I'm going to change the current object's shader settings, because I just want to reduce the opacity a bit so I can actually see through it, because I want to basically cut these bits into like 3 platforms. Basically, there's like 2 small ones, and then there's a large one in the middle, and it's a bit annoying kind of like having to try and guess where to make these cuts, so yeah, that always helps. And then here, yeah, just a little sort of axis scale, and again, for the last time, remember to reset that back to global space. I was about to add in a primitive here, in fact I think I do, but then I realized at some point that my shape is kind of wrong. You know, it's not going to work with the hinge that I can see in my reference images, because these small platforms on the side are actually higher up. So I just use the pose tool, and I use the select object mode, and I just kind of grab like a brush tool, and then I hit the H key just to make sure that I'm on the right layer. And then with that, you can just move the like that whole platform up, and now I can go back to basically making the actual hinge bits that connect. But then again, I realized that I kind of ran into another slightly issue. It seems that the middle portion of this is actually slightly thinner, or at least I think it has to be, because otherwise I don't understand how these hinges can work. So again, I do just kind of scale this one down just a touch. It's also worth mentioning at this point that if you're scaling non-uniformly with the pose tool, you don't have to worry about setting the scale back to global, because that's like an element scale rather than like an object, so it's all good. I did notice here that the lock parts through a bit, so I guess I just got the cutoff tool and just removed that. And now, actually, lastly, like the very last thing that we will do to this sculpt is just add in like a couple of some like cube primitives, which will just kind of exist underneath all of this, like inside the chest, and it will be the mechanism that actually lifts it up. But you know, you don't really ever get a good look at this, so there's no point in doing any kind of crazy geometry. We can just kind of add, you know, some random kind of metalness to it when it comes to the texturing stage. So there we are. That, I think, will about wrap it up for the sculpt. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to have the retopology done soon. I'm not sure how soon, hopefully within a week, although, you know, it's best not to promise anything. But yeah, I'm not sure if I mentioned it at all in the start of the video or not, but we are taking this thing like through the pipeline and into the engine. So, you know, at the end of it, we are going to have, you know, like a nice kind of textured and animated model. So yeah, stick around for that. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you in the next one.